If you're someone who rarely posts photos online, no selfies, no personal updates, no glimpses into your private life, there's a good chance people have questioned you about it. Maybe they said you're strange and asocial, or that you must be hiding something. But the truth is, none of those assumptions are accurate. You're not strange, you're not hiding, and you're definitely not antisocial. In reality, you're doing something that many people who spend hours on social media struggle to do. You stepped away from the stage. Because if we're being honest, social media today works a lot like a 24-hour performance arena. People post, share, and update constantly, almost like they're performing for an audience. But instead of joining the show, you quietly walked toward the exit. And what's fascinating is that psychology suggests this choice often comes from something much deeper than a simple dislike of social media. For many people, the roots of this behavior were formed long before platforms like Instagram or Facebook even existed. Let's take a closer look. While a lot of people treat their online profiles almost like a personal brand, carefully selecting photos, crafting captions, and managing how they appear to others, you chose something different. You chose privacy. And that decision doesn't mean you're distant or unfriendly. It means you're intentional. Psychologists sometimes describe this tendency as having a high privacy orientation. In simple terms, it means some individuals naturally prefer to keep their personal lives separate from public spaces, especially online ones. A study published in 2019 in a major medical journal found that people who score high in conscientiousness, those who are thoughtful, deliberate, and careful about their actions, are often far more protective of their personal information on the internet. So this isn't always a decision someone suddenly makes one day. For many people, it's simply part of their personality. That's just the way they're wired. So the next time someone asks you, why don't you ever post anything? What they may actually be asking, without realizing it, is something closer to this. Why don't you seek the kind of attention that I do? And the truth is, you don't owe anyone an explanation. You're not invisible. You're intentional. But privacy alone doesn't explain everything. There's another layer beneath the surface. Back in 1996, a psychologist named Jennifer Campbell from the University of British Columbia developed something called the Self-Concept Clarity Scale. Her research focused on how clearly people understand themselves, how certain they are about who they are, what they believe, and what defines them. And the results revealed something interesting. People who have a strong and stable sense of identity usually don't rely on outside validation to confirm it. Think about how most people interact with social media. For many, it functions like a mirror. They share a post, upload a photo, or write a thought, and then they wait. They wait for likes, comments, reactions, signals that reflect something back to them. Those responses can subtly shape how they see themselves. But people with strong self-concept clarity tend to use social media differently, or sometimes barely at all. Instead of a mirror, they treat it more like a window. They observe what's happening around them. They take things in. They watch. But they don't necessarily need that reflection staring back at them. That doesn't mean they don't care what others think. It simply means their sense of identity isn't built on those opinions. And in today's world, that kind of internal stability is actually rarer than many people realize. It goes even deeper than identity. Psychologists often talk about two different types of self-esteem. The first type is fragile self-esteem. This kind needs constant reinforcement. It depends heavily on praise, validation, and approval from others. The second type is secure self-esteem. This kind doesn't rely as much on external feedback. It's more stable and internally grounded. A study published in 2021 in the Journal of Communication found that social media use is frequently associated with lower self-esteem. But here's the important detail. The effect depends on the individual. For people whose self-esteem is already secure, social media doesn't have the same emotional impact. It doesn't shake their sense of self the way it might for others. So if you're someone who rarely posts, it doesn't automatically mean you're insecure. In fact, sometimes it means the opposite. You may simply not need social media to feel complete. Your sense of worth already has its own foundation. Now let me ask you something. Does any of this sound familiar? If it does, keep listening, because there's another side to this conversation that often gets overlooked. Everything we've talked about so far is true, but it's not the entire story. Not everyone who avoids posting online is doing it from a place of strength. Sometimes the reason is more complicated. A while ago, someone left a comment that really stood out. They said, "I stopped posting pictures 3 years ago, not because I found peace with myself, but because every time I saw my face on screen, I remembered the things people used to say about my appearance in school." That's a completely different situation. That's not privacy. That's protection. Choosing not to post because you feel secure in yourself is a boundary. Choosing not to post because you feel ashamed is more like building a wall. And those two things may look the same on the outside, but internally, they come from very different places. So it's worth asking yourself honestly, are you choosing privacy, or are you avoiding visibility? There's no shame in either answer. Recognizing the difference is simply the first step toward understanding yourself better. For those whose preference for privacy comes from a healthy place, psychology offers another interesting perspective. One of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, Carl Rogers, believed that many of our core behaviors are shaped early in life. He introduced a concept called conditions of worth. This idea suggests that when people grow up in environments where love and acceptance feel conditional, where approval depends on behaving a certain way, looking a certain way, or meeting certain expectations, they learn an important lesson early on. Visibility can feel risky. Maybe you had a parent who was difficult to impress, not cruel, but critical. Maybe praise came only when you met certain standards. Over time, you might have stopped trying to impress anyone at all. Or perhaps you were the dependable one in your family, the person others leaned on for support. You became the listener, the helper, the stable presence. And somewhere along the way, you learned that your role was to create space for others, not necessarily to occupy the spotlight yourself. Eventually, consciously or unconsciously, you may have decided that the safest approach was to keep your inner life more private. Not because you lack confidence, but because you were protecting something valuable, something many people unknowingly give away. Carl Rogers described this mindset with another concept called the internal locus of evaluation. In simple terms, it means you evaluate yourself based on your own standards rather than relying heavily on society's opinions. While many people scroll through social media, silently asking themselves, "Am I good enough?" you may have already answered that question long ago, and you didn't need a single like or comment to do it. Rogers believed that psychologically healthy individuals eventually learn to trust their inner voice more than outside approval. So, ironically, the behavior that society sometimes labels as weird might actually represent something more evolved. Let that sink in for a moment. But there's one final piece of the puzzle. Back in 1954, psychologist Leon Festinger introduced a theory that explains much of how people behave online today. It's called social comparison theory. The idea is simple but powerful. Humans naturally compare themselves to others. We look at other people's lives, achievements, appearances, and experiences and measure ourselves against them. Social media didn't create this instinct, but it amplified it dramatically. Today, those comparisons happen constantly. Scrolling through social media can become a kind of endless treadmill, an ongoing cycle of measuring, judging, and evaluating. But if you rarely post and maybe even limit how much you engage with social platforms, there's a chance you've stepped off that treadmill entirely. You didn't lose the game. You simply stopped playing. Interestingly, research from Georgetown University has suggested that reducing social media use can significantly improve mental well-being, sometimes producing benefits comparable to certain forms of therapy. So the reality is this. You're not necessarily missing out. You might simply be opting out. And those are two very different things. So let's bring everything together. If you don't post photos online, it doesn't mean you're hiding. It doesn't mean you're antisocial. And it definitely doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It may simply mean that you value privacy more than performance. It may mean your sense of identity isn't built on digital reactions. And for many people, that mindset developed long before they ever opened a social media account. Interestingly, On a video discussing this exact topic, one comment stood out above the rest. It had more than 28,000 likes. The comment said, "What kind of world do we live in where choosing not to show your personal photos to the entire internet is considered strange?" Tens of thousands of people agreed, which means one thing: you're far from alone. So consider this your reminder. You don't have to post. You don't have to perform. And you don't need to prove your identity to people who only know you through a screen. In a world that constantly rewards the loudest voices and the biggest displays, you chose something different. You chose a quieter space. Not because you have nothing to say, but because your sense of worth doesn't depend on having an audience. And maybe that quiet confidence is proof that depth still exists in a world obsessed with visibility. If this perspective resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. When did you first realize that your relationship with social media was different from most people's? And if you'd like to hear more conversations like this, consider subscribing.